We're out here at one of our wetland sites in southern Louisiana, and the good Dr. John Lambrinos and I are talking about restoration and conservation goals. So this site is heavily disturbed. It was a closed canopy forest before Hurricane Katrina hit, and that storm radically impacted this this forest, this wetland, and it knocked down a bunch of trees. And then over the course of the subsequent years, trees that were weakened fell down. It changed from a dark, sort of what you might call a late successional sort of stage. That's debatable, but a forest with a lot of big trees that were very old. That meaning like, you know, decades and decades old at least, if not older. Some of our trees are like 1700s and stuff, but old trees, tall trees, dark underneath, with more like this kind of stuff, kind of ferny type stuff. So we are sitting here talking about what should our goals, ultimate conservation goals for this be. And so we have said that examples of some of the goals. So it also in the time of a changing planet, in the Anthropocene. And so, what should the goals be? So, John, do you want to spout off any of the potential, the conspicuous goals that we typically talk about in terms of restoring this area or conserving this area?
Yeah, so like one set of like just strictly conservation ecological goals are biodiversity conservation. So there's lots of species that are native to this region, and we would like them to come back.
Right.
And so that's one goal. And then there's sort of goals that are associated with just the diversity of species you have in a forest like this. There's also the sort of goals that are related to the functions that those species provide, like storm protection, right? And some of those are tied to whether they're native or not, but other ones are not really strongly tied
Right.
to, you know, a big tall tree provides, whether it's native or non-native, can provide the same storm protection. And then there's sort of, a lot of those are sort of like kind of global goals, or they're broad societal goals. Like all these trees are sequestering carbon, right? So we'd like to have, there'll be one value if we turn this back into a forest again, right? Is that carbon sequestration value. But there's also sort of more local goals, so the folks who are actually using this spot. Right?
People having recreational times in this forest.
Yeah, so people come out and they hike. We just had a jogger go by, and we were just walking through a section where all the big trees are down, and it's basically an open meadow, and it was freaking hot in there. It was super hot, super sunny.
There were three of us when we left. Now there's only two.
Now there's only two of us.
Someone gave up the goat and went back.
And you know, just sitting here, just kind of the microclimate here just seems more pleasant. It's more relaxing.
Right where you're standing, in the shade, right.
And so there's that aspect of it. So this is probably just as a place that people would like to enjoy to be in.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably there's variation in how the structure of the community and the ecosystem, how that relates to how people enjoy it and
the aesthetics,
they
right?
Enjoy it, the aesthetics. But in addition to that, there's also sort of the cultural aspects of it. So here we have a cypress tree, which is sort of an iconic tree of Louisiana, and the historical legacy and traditions associated with the habitat you can't have that if in a forest which is filled with non-native, you lose something, you lose part of that tradition, right? And so that's sort of independent of, you know, the biological or ecological reasons for wanting to have a native species. There's sort of just a cultural aspect of that as well,
and religious for some,
right? And so all these different goals are, on one hand, can be sort of, some are relatively easy to achieve, other ones are relatively hard to achieve. Some of them may not be feasible to achieve in the Anthropocene. And then layered on top of that is folks often have different goals in different ways, right? And oftentimes those get played out in the politics and the economics and the social structures of the time. So, some people might value the biodiversity and the carbon sequestration values more than the folks who are actively using this forest might have a different set of goals that they prioritize differently, and who we listen to,
Right.
and who we say, oh, we agree with these goals, and this is going to be the goals that we set for this property. How that gets played out, as we've been reminded of very recently, is often played out through things like who has the power, who has the money, who has the ability to make the changes, and so that's sort of another layer of what happens, how we decide what this place looks like.
Yeah, and in addition to that, we also have what the hell's going to happen in the future. So we sort of operate on the idea that the disturbances or the future threats or the future influences on this forest are going to be like they have been in the past, and that's perhaps a cautionary tale. And so one of the examples we were talking about are hurricanes. And so we got to this current state most recently because of the relatively infrequent landing of a big, strong, powerful hurricane right here and influencing the ecosystem. But even in just the less than 2 decades that we've been working here, we've seen that happen several times. Most recently, Hurricane Ida just last year. And so some of these things that we think of as infrequent disturbances might be becoming more the norm. And so the landscape that we're trying to cultivate this ecosystem in and restore these functions or install these functions or create these functions, if that's what the decision is, it's a challenge because it's a moving target, right? We don't know, we have guesses, but we don't have a precise playbook as to how it's going to turn out. So that's also another challenging overlay here.
And you use the word cultivate, which brings up another, it's almost philosophical thing that we are struggling with,
right,
particularly in the Anthropocene, which is that one answer that people have had is, well, what hubris do we have to think that we can decide what this is going to look like, right? It's nature who decides what this place looks like, and we should just let nature decide what this place is going to look like, right?
That was the argument of my chain-smoking roommate freshman year, who used to tell me, like, dude, you think you know better than nature? That's the argument. That's the Matty T argument.
But increasingly, it's dawning on us that the world is as much a reflection of us as we are a reflection of the world.
Yeah.
Right? And so the fact that if we cultivate this, right? If we go out and we're planting things, we're weeding things, that sounds very much to many people like horticulture, which was sort of the exact reason why conservation biology and restoration ecology was sort of imagined. It was like, we're not taking sort of an agronomic approach, a real narrow human-centered focus on the world. Like, here's, we have an eroding hillside, we're going to pick the fastest thing to grow on that hillside. So
ecological principles is what we're going to use.
We're going to try and nudge nature along, give nature a little help to get all those ecological processes and ecological functionings happening. But now we're increasingly in a world where all those ecological processes and ecological functionings have us nudging them in various ways.
Right.
Like this hydrology here is
explicitly and implicitly,
has been radically changed, right? So this is no longer really the wetland it was 200 years ago, right? So that's almost a sort of a philosophical thing of sort of how much of a hand do we put into nature in trying to protect and conserve and restore these increasingly diminishing bits of nature? How much do we manipulate it to keep that nature?
Yeah, and I mean, and ultimately, that's a huge challenge for us as conservation professionals, right? Because we have all that's going on, and yet we have to communicate to the public that this place still has value, even if we're not sure the best path, and that there's still, you can walk down the path and still eat mulberries and still